This paper examines the life and career of French Catholic musician Jean-Baptiste Prache de Tilloy. He is a musician who has been largely lost to history. He is a colleague of Zelenka. Prache de Tilloy entered court service to the Saxon Elector and Polish King August the Strong, a decade prior to his Dresden colleague Jan Dismas Zelenka. We can certainly classify Prache de Tilloy as one of the many lesser-known Dresden court musicians of the period. While his name is included in court musician lists in the most recent Dresden entries of Musik in Geschichte und Gegenwart and Grove Music Online, the latter writes his name incorrectly, and no further details are given beyond his association with cello and that he was famous at the time. Today's paper documents fragments of his career and life and argues such lives are worthy of further investigation. We have much Dresden expertise at this Zelenka conference. For any requiring context, though, allow me to present a brief overview of aesthetics of the court's ruler. Born in 1670, August the Strong, or more properly Friedrich August I, or Augustus II, was the second heir to Saxon Elector Johann Georg III, who ruled 1680 to 1691. As second-born son, August was destined for a military career. He was therefore allowed a different grand tour than his elder brother, spending 2 full years away, of which a significant proportion was spent in Paris and at the French court of Louis XIV. It was during this time August the Strong truly became a Francophile. Following the unexpected death of his brother, he gained the crown in 1694. After a strategic conversion to Catholicism, August was in 1697 elected as king to the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. A forced abdication in 1706 was followed by his restoration in 1709. These political changes saw August maintaining 2 major seats of power. In addition to Dresden, many court musicians of August the Strong now also served at the Polish court in Warsaw. Outside of August the Strong's reign, the dominant imported cultural influence at the Dresden court was Italian. Indeed, the city is remembered as the Florence of the Elbe. The refocus to French influence, however, was immediate on August's accession. In one of his first acts as elector in 1694, he dismissed a troupe of Italian actors. For a musician largely absent from historical memory, we are fortunate basic life details of Jean-Baptiste Prache de Tilloy are known through the musician's own handwritten testimony. Like most Dresden Hofkapelle musicians employed in the year 1717, Zelenka being one exception, Prache de Tilloy provided a short autobiographical note to the court in his own hand. These pages were subsequently filed by administrators, sewing them into the Hofbuch, which functioned for the years 1717 to 1720. Kai Koep was the first to publish an examination of this important document in 2005. The list is undated, but it is generally accepted that they were compiled sometime during 1717 and 1718, based on information therein that is confirmed in other sources. In his note, Prache de Tilloy records his birthplace as Paris and his age as 45. Based on the ascribed time of writing, his birth year would fall in 1672 or 73. So Prache de Tilloy was of a similar age to Zelenka, who was born at the end of the same decade in October 1679. Of Prache de Tilloy's education and early career, we can at this time only surmise. Regarding his private life, Dresden primary sources show Prache de Tilloy was Catholic and, like many, had close social and familial bonds with other court servants and who were also serving as musicians. He was married to soprano Marguerite Geneviève Prache de Tilloy, née de Vanneau. She was a member of the French opera troupe by 1718 at the latest, receiving a higher annual salary of 400 thaler as a soprano soloist than her instrumentalist husband. She last appears in the court calendar in 1732, though her petitions as widow to the Dresden court continue into 1734. The work of Augustsson and Stockig Examining census records of Catholics serving at the Dresden court indicate by 1724 his household included his wife, extended family of a cousin, and possibly servants. Prush de Tilloy's autobiographical note is worded carefully to emphasise that he was under contract to serve August the Strong in 1699, and of the sequence of notes we have, this is very unusual wording. Behind those details is a complex phase of his career. In 1699, he was in his city of birth in Paris, not initially engaged as a cellist of the Hofkapelle. Rather, Prush de Tilloy first served the king at his Polish court as a member of a grandly scaled French opera troupe that had been assembled in Paris in that year and, at least according to 19th century Dresden court historian Moritz Fürstenau, was subsequently disbanded in Dresden in 1705. It comprised, in total, 93 musicians, singers, dancers, and actors, along with numerous support staff and family members. Many individuals had multiple specialties. This particular troupe could be viewed as an ultimately unsuccessful attempt by August the Strong to establish his own permanent company of French players, and part of a 14-year period of ad hoc arrangements for French troops that began in 1696. It was only in 1709 that August the Strong finally established his own permanent court ensemble in this style. The planning for this French ensemble had been 3 years in the making. In the same year of 1697, when he received the Polish crown, August the Strong had engaged Italian Angelo Constantini to form the company. Constantini held an earlier association with August the Strong through the Braunschweig-Lüneburg Cell Court. Polish musicologist Alina Zaraska-Witkowska has, through significant archival studies, identified new correspondence between the two individuals. With a reputation as a fine actor, singer, dancer, and lutenist, Constantini had become available in 1697, following Louis XIV's dramatic disbanding of the Parisian Comédie Italienne troupe in the same year. From 1682, Constantini had been associated with the Commedia dell'arte in Paris and had invented in the following year, 1683, this famous servant character, Metasam, a character who held a principal role performing the staged musical elements of the form. Despite being Italian, he was well suited for an impresario role of the Comédie Française ensemble, which was to be assembled in the French capital under instruction from August the Strong. Now, Prush de Tilloy was contracted as a dancer and copyist, not a cellist. The ensemble arrived in Warsaw in May 1700 and remained at the Polish court for several years. His name is not found in an annotated Dresden register of musicians at the end of 1704, whose marginalia show most of the musicians from Warsaw had relocated to Dresden by that time. Zaraska-Witkowska concludes that by 1707, Prush de Tilloy was in Dresden and served as a Hofkapelle cellist. Fürstenau, also without indicating a source, reports by 1709, or mid-1709, he had an annual salary of 250 thaler for the same role. The earliest Dresden archival source I have located in Prush de Tilloy is from January 1710, and the musicians he is listed with were primarily French trained. The absence of Prush de Tilloy in the Hofkapelle rosters does not entirely negate the possibility that he played with them at this time. In these years, he may have done so informally, as was the case in this slide for his French-trained colleague Robert de Ullendel, although he's not listed by his name, he's La France Le Père here. Primary sources in this slide document that certain Hofkapelle cellists drew salaries from the French opera troupe but functioned in the orchestra. So the written Dresden financial and administrative evidence may not fully reflect practices of the time. While Prush de Tilloy's dancing career was likely replaced by his activities as an instrumentalist at the Dresden court, his second role as copyist continued. For his work as copyist, he should have received a separate salary. Two personnel rosters indicate by 1711 his salary as cellist, rose to the moderate figure of 300 thaler, and it was maintained at that level for the remainder of his employment. Elements of his copying duties speak to important connections between musicians and the repertoire played. I'm going to use a different example, but I just speak to this slide to point, it's much more legible that you have these very grand initials of the copyist Prash de Tilloy, and an entire absence of the composer being listed in a set of performance parts. But rather than we will look at some Marais, and you'll find his initials a little harder to see at the bottom. His set of Dresden parts remain from the symphony of the Act 4 Tempest scene arranged from Marais' opera Alcyon. This is a celebrated work in Paris opera history, famed for being first to specifically require contrabasses. Prior to that, the contrabass was used at the Paris Opera often only as a special effect, or if you bought Friday matinee tickets, as a Friday novelty feature. Performing only this popular symphony of the Tempest scene was a tradition begun soon after the original opera production staged in 1706. For example, in February 1711, the instrumental scene from the Tempest was performed for Louis XIV at his Chateau de Marly. Based on the number of musicians named on various parts of this work, the Dresden set was played on more than one occasion. The main set of 9 parts is in the hand of Prash de Tilloy that you've already seen. Several named musicians began their association with the Dresden court in 1709, so the materials could not have been played by this personnel prior to that year. Musicians named on these parts also helped to provide a terminus antequem. For example, Leconte is known to have been active at the court only during the period 1709 to prior to March 1711. Herring died sometime between 1712 and 1716. The original set of parts here does not indicate use of a contrabass instrument. Instead, bassoon is required. The evidence here suggests that this French work is being tailored at the very outset to the taste of the Dresden court. A second, later set of parts, also in the hand of Prash de Tilloy, includes one where Kessner has been written in the corner in pencil. This part is labelled for basso continuo or harpsichord, is added later in smaller writing. This part and the second continuo part of the same second set show further change in the Dresden context. It is here that the bass line is augmented and the contrabass bowed strings are specified in a part in diminution, and this measure of further adaptation now aligns to the novel Paris practices, and this is a shift in Dresden to including contrabass strings in the repertoire. Importantly, this is through the work of copyist Prash de Tilloy. Looking at other sources, in 1720 he submits a most detailed petition to the court regarding his copyist role, not to the elector, but to August's cabinet minister, Count Christian Heinrich von Butzdorf. Prash de Tilloy's ultimately successful petition, and I must say, out of my experience with petitions, they're not often successful at this court, he is compensated at minimum a discounted huge sum of 2,500 thaler for a decade's unpaid copyist work. He demonstrates profound supplication through the unusually long letter, clear in the most formulaic and high register salutation and valediction. He opens, "It is with profound respect that I present to your excellency that it appears he is not well informed on the subject of my affairs. I will therefore take the liberty of instructing him on this at greater length," and it is some length. He also qualifies the depth of activity required for a music copyist at a major court over a decade, reporting that 15,560 lines of music penned over 843 pages of large paper. And if this is anything like accurate, it shows we have lost nearly everything for this copyist. Most remarkably, without breaching the confines of diplomacy, the petition includes a near Machiavellian attempt to force the hand of Count von Butzdorf into paying the wages grossly in arrears by politely threatening to take back the music that he has copied that the king currently needs if the matter is not adequately resolved. Further court petitions in the months surrounding Prash de Tilloy's death in 1734, February 1734, are this time from his wife, describing a 3-year illness that surely precludes performing duties if he indeed had, as poetically described, has lost use of his arms and legs and only retains notions of childhood. Sadly, after more than 30 years of loyal service and only months before his death, he and his wife were dismissed from their comedian roles in a parallel act of August the Strong's successor, the disbanding of the French comedians as part of a new reorientation of the court aesthetics back to the Italian. Only the French ballet troupe would survive. On February 1730, Prash de Tilloy was buried in the Dresden's Catholic cemetery. It was unusual for the scribe of the city's Totenbuch, or Catholic Register of Deaths, to record a cause. He does so in Prash de Tilloy's case, noting some kind of tremor, in Latin tremor unitionem. A court note filed adjacent to his widow's further court petition dated 31st of May 1734 as Le Veuve Prash describes 3 years of illness suffered by her husband. The repeated pleas for financial support at least evoke a portrait of poverty, and there is a larger story there for another time. With these physical and mental incapacities, Prash de Tilloy's long illness would surely have resulted in him being an invalid, unable to fulfill his performing role for an extended period before his death. His widow's description suggests that he was potentially ill from in or around the very beginning of 1731. Yet despite this, his name is retained as part of the list of Hofkapelle cellists in the court calendar prepared and published in late 1732 for the following year. As such, the assumed size of the Hofkapelle cello section in the first years of the 1730s was probably not as large as official personnel records suggest. Prash de Tilloy's situation provides evidence of the court providing a salary during extended incapacitating illness. It further demonstrates the need to reconcile official personnel records against archival sources. In conclusion, the life and career of a musician at a major court of a profile such as Jean-Baptiste Prash de Tilloy is not radically different to his far more celebrated colleague Zelenka. They were colleagues in the bass section of the court orchestra, but with significant creative roles beyond. They both contributed to the repertoire of the court. While Zelenka composed and taught, the work of Prash de Tilloy reveals a Dresden copyist was not merely copying notes to generate performance materials. It demonstrates sophisticated decisions about selecting material, orchestration, and tailoring to a degree that we would associate with the role of arranger or composer rather than technician. Through his music copyist activities, Prash de Tilloy fulfilled a pivotal role, providing the Saxon court with music in the imported French style. On a broad level, I would argue that today's vignette illuminates aspects of the more common professional lived experience when understood in context provides different access to the musical culture of the past that our celebrated master musicians may not, and further extends our understanding of the collegiate context for Zelenka. Thank you.